The day my boss called me into his office and told me I was being let go, he couldn't even look me in the eyes. He stared at his desk. He shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling. He said words like restructuring and budget constraints and nothing personal, while I sat across from him knowing, with absolute certainty, that every single word coming out of his mouth was a lie. I had given that company 9 years of my life. 9 years of early mornings and late nights. 9 years of fixing other people's mistakes and never taking credit. 9 years of being the woman everyone called when something went wrong because they knew I would fix it. And he fired me on a Tuesday afternoon so he could give my job to his daughter. I want to tell you what happened next. Because what happened next is the reason I'm sitting here today, in an office 3 times the size of the one he took from me, telling this story with a smile on my face. But first, let me tell you how we got there. My name is Marilyn. I'm 41 years old. I spent 9 years as the senior operations manager at a mid-sized logistics company called Hartwell Freight. We handled distribution contracts for about 60 corporate clients across the region. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important work and I was genuinely good at it. I joined Hartwell when I was 32, after a difficult period in my life that had cost me both my savings and my confidence. A relationship that ended badly. A cross-country move that didn't work out the way I had planned. I landed back in my hometown with very little and a very strong need to rebuild something solid under my feet. Hartwell gave me that. The company was owned and run by a man named Gerald Hartwell. He was in his late 50s when I joined, the kind of man who wore the same brand of khaki pants every single day and kept a photo of a fish he caught in 1987 on his office wall like it was a Renaissance painting. He was not brilliant. He was not visionary. But in those early years, he was fair. He paid decent salaries. He promoted based on performance. He left his managers alone to do their jobs. I thrived under that system. Within 2 years, I had streamlined our routing operations and saved the company roughly $400,000 annually. Gerald noticed. He promoted me to senior operations manager and gave me a raise that at the time felt like proof that hard work still meant something. I bought a small house. I started saving properly. I built a life I was proud of from the ground up. And for a while, things were genuinely good. Then Gerald's daughter came back from California. Her name was Brianna. She was 26 years old. She had spent 3 years in Los Angeles trying to start a lifestyle brand, which as far as I could tell meant she had an Instagram account with decent engagement and a failed collaboration with a mid-tier influencer that she mentioned approximately once every conversation. She had no logistics experience. She had no operations experience. She had, as far as anyone could determine, no particular experience with anything that would be relevant to running a freight company. What she had was a father who owned one. Gerald announced at a company-wide meeting that Brianna would be joining the team as a strategic development consultant, a title that had not previously existed and which nobody could adequately define when asked. She would be reporting directly to Gerald. She would have access to all departmental data. She would be observing operations across all teams. I smiled at that meeting and said the right things, and went back to my desk and felt, for the first time since joining Hartwell, a cold thread of unease move through me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. Brianna started the following Monday. She was pleasant enough on the surface. Friendly, well-dressed, the kind of person who remembered everyone's name and brought pastries on her first day. She sat in on my team meetings without asking. She sent me emails at 10 o'clock at night asking questions about operational processes that took me 45 minutes to answer properly. She CC'd her father on everything. Within 2 weeks, she had started offering suggestions in my meetings. They were not good suggestions. They were the suggestions of someone who had read 2 articles about supply chain optimization and believed that made them qualified to overhaul a system that had taken years to build. I handled them carefully. I explained, politely and thoroughly, why certain approaches wouldn't work in our specific context. I gave her credit when she raised a point that had any merit at all, even minor merit. I thought I was managing the situation professionally. What I was actually doing was making her look uninformed in front of my team, week after week, without realizing that she was going home every night and telling her father a completely different version of those meetings. The first sign that something was actively wrong came about 3 months after Brianna arrived. Gerald called me into his office for what he described as a routine check-in. These happened every quarter. They were normally 20 minutes of mutual affirmation where Gerald told me I was doing a great job and I told him the team was performing well, and we both went back to our days. This one was different. Gerald sat across from me and asked, in a careful tone I had never heard from him before, whether I felt I was being collaborative enough with the new strategic initiatives Brianna was developing. I kept my face completely neutral. I think I've been very collaborative, I said. I've attended every meeting she's invited me to, answered every question she sent, and implemented several of her suggestions where they were viable. She feels like you're resistant, Gerald said. I looked at him. Resistant to what specifically? He couldn't give me a specific. He said something vague about embracing change and being open to fresh perspectives. I nodded and said I would reflect on that feedback. I left his office and sat in my car in the parking lot for 10 minutes before going back inside. That night I started keeping a record. Every email, every meeting, every suggestion made, and my documented response to it. Every interaction with Brianna, logged with date and time and outcome. I did not know exactly what I was preparing for, but something in me said I needed to be able to prove what was actually happening versus what was being reported to Gerald. That instinct saved me later, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Over the next several months, the pattern became clearer and uglier. Brianna would propose something in a meeting. I would engage with it seriously, explain the operational realities, offer a modified version where possible. Brianna would smile and say she understood. Then she would go to Gerald and tell him I had shut her down. Gerald would call me in for a conversation. I would explain what had actually happened. Gerald would look vaguely unconvinced and say something about teamwork. Rinse and repeat. I want you to understand something about what this kind of thing does to a woman in a workplace. When a man pushes back on a bad idea, he's called decisive. When a woman does the same thing, she's called difficult. I had spent 9 years navigating that carefully. I had learned exactly how to hold my ground without triggering the word that ends careers. And Brianna, whether she understood this consciously or not, was using it against me perfectly. Every time I explained why something wouldn't work, she reframed it to her father as hostility. Every time I offered an alternative, she described it as obstruction. I was being painted as the obstacle between Gerald's daughter and her potential, and Gerald, who loved that daughter more than he understood his own company, was choosing to believe the painting. Meanwhile, Brianna's role was quietly expanding. She was given a budget. She hired 2 junior staff who reported to her. She started attending client meetings that had previously been my domain. When I raised this with Gerald, he said it was cross-functional learning and that it would benefit the company. I went home that night and told my partner, David, what was happening. David is a quiet man with very good judgment. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about him. When I finished, he set down his fork and said, Marilyn, I want you to think carefully about what I'm about to say. She's not being trained. She's being positioned. You need to decide now what you're going to do when they try to remove you. I said I thought I was being paranoid. David looked at me with the steady patience of a man who has learned that when I say I'm being paranoid, I am usually describing something that is actually happening. 2 months later, Gerald called me in and told me my position was being eliminated. He used the word restructuring. He said the company was evolving its operational model. He said my contributions had been valued. He could not look at me. I sat very still. Is Brianna taking my role? I asked. Brianna is moving into an expanded leadership position, he said carefully. It's a different role structurally. But she'll be doing what I do. He reshuffled his papers. The structure will be different, he said again. I was given 4 weeks of severance and a non-disparagement agreement to sign. I thanked him for the 9 years. I shook his hand. I picked up the box of my things from my office. I walked out of that building and I sat in my car, and I did not cry. I had expected to cry. Instead, I felt something I can only describe as cold clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when something you have been half seeing suddenly comes completely into focus. like a photograph developing in real time. I called David. He picked up on the first ring. I said, "You were right." He said, "Come home. We'll figure this out together." I did not sign the non-disparagement agreement. Drop a comment right now. Have you ever worked twice as hard as everyone else and still been pushed out? Because what Marilyn does next is something most people don't have the courage to do. And if you're new here, subscribe, because this story is about to get very, very satisfying. My lawyer's name was Patricia. She was sharp, experienced, and had a way of reading documents that made you feel like nothing could be hidden from her. I had used her once before for a contract dispute years earlier, and I had kept her number because good lawyers are worth keeping. I called her the morning after I was fired. She told me not to sign anything for at least 2 weeks. She reviewed the severance offer and told me it was on the low end for someone of my tenure and role level. Then she asked me a question that changed everything. Do you have any documentation of what led to this? I told her about the records I had been keeping for 8 months. She went quiet for a moment. Send me everything, she said. What Patricia found in those records was a story I had been too close to see clearly. A consistent pattern of pretextual performance concerns raised only after Brianna's arrival, with nothing in my official HR file to support them. A clear timeline showing that my so-called restructuring had been preceded by Brianna systematically absorbing my operational responsibilities. Language in Gerald's emails that strongly implied the decision to remove me had been made long before any formal process began. And then she found something I hadn't noticed myself. In one of the emails I had forwarded to my personal account for documentation, Gerald had accidentally included an internal thread that was never meant to reach me. In that thread, Gerald and Brianna had discussed transitioning Marilyn out for months before I was actually fired. The email used my name. It discussed my salary and how it could be reallocated to support Brianna's expanded mandate. It was dated 5 months before Gerald sat across from me and said the word restructuring. The restructuring was invented. The decision had been made months before I was told. And I had the email thread proving it. Patricia set down the papers and looked at me across her desk. "This is wrongful termination," she said. "And it's a strong case." Part of me wanted to file immediately. Part of me wanted to walk back into that building with Patricia beside me and watch Gerald's face change when he realized what I had. But Patricia counseled patience. Litigation was slow and expensive and emotionally draining, she said, and there was a faster option worth trying first. She sent a letter to Hartwell's legal counsel. The letter was precise and professional. It outlined the documentation we had. It outlined the legal exposure. It made a settlement demand that was considerably higher than the original severance offer. Gerald's lawyers responded within a week. They did not want this anywhere near a courtroom. We settled for an amount I am not able to disclose publicly. What I can tell you is that it was enough to give me a full year of financial security without touching my savings, which meant I had time. Real time. Time to be deliberate about what came next instead of desperate. I spent the first 2 weeks doing almost nothing intentional. I slept well, which surprised me. I cooked proper meals. David and I took long evening walks and talked about things that had nothing to do with logistics or Gerald or any of it. I let the 9 years decompress out of my body slowly, the way you let air out of something that has been inflated too long. And then I started making calls. Here is something I had not fully understood about myself until that moment. In 9 years of pouring everything into Hartwell, I had quietly built a professional network that I had never properly used. Clients I had solved problems for. Vendors I had treated with genuine respect when I didn't have to. Former colleagues who had moved on to other companies and remembered that I was the person who actually delivered. I had forgotten those relationships existed. They had not forgotten me. The first call I made was to a woman named Claire Navarro. Claire had been the operations director at Nexus Distribution, Hartwell's largest client. For most of the time, I had managed that account. We had worked closely for 6 years, and I trusted her completely. She had left Nexus a year earlier to join a growing freight startup called Calvary Logistics as their VP of strategy. I called her just to talk, to tell her what had happened, not to ask for anything. She called me back the same afternoon. She said, "Marilyn, I've been trying to figure out how to reach out to you for months. I didn't want to poach you while you were still at Hartwell. We have a director of operations role that has been open for 4 months, and I haven't filled it because I haven't found anyone I trust enough. Are you available? I sat down. Tell me about the role, I said. Calvary Logistics was smaller than Hartwell, but growing faster than almost anything I had seen at that stage. They had real contracts and genuine capital behind them. What they didn't have was operational discipline. The systems were messy, the processes were inconsistent, costs were bleeding in places nobody had properly examined. They needed someone who had actually built and run a logistics operation, not someone learning on the job. They offered me director of operations. The base salary was 19% higher than what Hartwell had been paying me. The title was better. There was an equity component that Hartwell had never offered. And Claire, whose judgment I had trusted for 6 years, would be a direct peer. I said yes before I left the building. I started at Calvary 6 weeks after leaving Hartwell. Back at Hartwell, things were coming apart quietly, and then all at once. I want to be honest here. I was not watching Hartwell. I had real work at Calvary, and a team that needed my full attention, and I gave it that. But our industry is not large. People talk over lunch and at conferences and in the margins of professional calls. Information arrived whether I went looking for it or not. The first thing I heard was that Hartwell had lost the Nexus distribution contract. Nexus had been Hartwell's single largest client, 18% of annual revenue. An 11-year relationship that I had personally managed and maintained through 3 contract renewals, 2 ownership transitions on Nexus's side, and more operational crises than I could count. When I left, that relationship had no one behind it who understood it. Brianna had been assigned nominal oversight of the Nexus account as part of her expanded responsibilities. By every account I heard later, the transition had been a slow disaster. Response times dropped. Errors went unaddressed. The resolution processes I had spent years building were either not being followed or not being understood. Nexus gave formal notice of non-renewal. 9 months after firing me, Hartwell lost 18% of its revenue. The second thing I heard came from a former colleague named Sandra, one of the few people at Hartwell I had stayed genuinely close to. We had coffee occasionally, and she was careful about what she shared, which I respected. But about 6 months after I left, she told me that 3 other senior staff members had resigned. Not dramatically, she said. Not with a scene. They had just quietly found other opportunities and taken them. Because the operational culture had changed. The systems I had built required someone who understood them to maintain them, and without that understanding, the daily experience of working inside those systems had become frustrating in ways that were hard to articulate, but impossible to ignore. Good people leave when they have somewhere better to go. Hartwell was becoming a place where good people had reasons to leave. The third piece came through Claire, who heard it from a contact at an industry roundtable. Hartwell had lost 2 additional major contracts in a single quarter. On-time delivery metrics, which had been among the strongest in our regional market when I was running operations, had dropped to below industry average. There were quiet conversations about cash flow. Gerald Hartwell had fired his most experienced operational manager to install his daughter in her place. And his company was paying for it in the only currency that actually matters in business. I want to be careful about how I describe what I felt when I heard these things. Because the easy version of the story is that I felt triumphant. That I sat back and watched my old boss's company struggle and felt satisfied. But that is not what I felt. I felt sad, mostly. Not for Gerald, exactly, though I understood why he had done what he did even if it was wrong. I felt sad for the people at Hartwell who had nothing to do with any of it. The dispatchers and drivers and administrators who were watching their workplace deteriorate through no fault of their own. I knew those people. I had worked alongside some of them for 9 years. What I felt underneath the sadness was something quieter and more durable. I felt the specific satisfaction of a truth being proven. Because Gerald's story, that my role was redundant, that the company would evolve without me, that Brianna's fresh perspective was what Hartwell needed, that story was being written in reverse by every client who left and every employee who followed. My value was being demonstrated most clearly by my absence. And I had work to do. At Calvary, I spent the first 3 months the way I always begin anywhere new. Watching before acting. asking questions before drawing conclusions, mapping the gap between how the operation was supposed to work and how it was actually working, which in Calvary's case was a considerable gap. I talked to the people on the floor, and in the dispatch rooms and at the loading docks, because those are always the people who understand what is actually broken and why. By month 4, I had a complete operational overhaul plan. Not cosmetic changes. Structural ones. Process redesigns with measurable targets and clear accountability at every level. Claire and the founders gave me full authority to implement it. The results came in faster than I had projected. Within 2 quarters, on-time delivery rates had improved by 12 percentage points. Error rates dropped by more than a third. We renegotiated for vendor contracts that had been losing money quietly for years. 3 clients who had been circling toward leaving renewed, and 2 of them expanded their contracts. The founders started paying a different kind of attention. 8 months after I joined Calvary, they called me into a meeting and told me they were creating a chief operations officer position. They said they had built it with me in mind from the moment they saw what I was doing with the operation. They offered it to me. I became COO of Calvary Logistics 14 months after Gerald Hartwell told me my position was being eliminated due to restructuring. David brought home flowers that evening. He had stopped at 3 different shops, apparently looking for the exact right ones, which is the kind of thing he does that I will never stop finding endearing. We sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of wine we had been saving for something worth celebrating, and I looked at him across all the ordinary, beautiful clutter of our shared life, and I thought about that parking lot. The one where I had sat in my car after carrying my box out of Hartwell, waiting to feel something. I understood now what I had been feeling. It was the feeling of a door closing on a chapter that was over. Not an ending. A transition. The kind that only feels like loss until you can see what it was actually making room for. The last part of this story came to me without my looking for it, the way the last parts of these stories always do. Sandra called me on a Thursday morning. Not a text, a call. Sandra didn't call. I answered immediately. She said she was leaving Hartwell. I told her I was glad, that she deserved somewhere better. She thanked me and then said, "There's something I wanted to tell you before I left." Before I couldn't anymore. I waited. "Gerald is selling the company," she said. "A private equity group. The deal is close. And Marilyn, it's not a good sale. It's a distressed sale. 2 of the 3 biggest contracts are gone. They've lost 7 senior people in 18 months. The valuation is significantly below where it was 3 years ago. They're selling because they have to." I sat with that for a moment. "How is Brianna?" I asked. "She left 4 months ago," Sandra said quietly. "I don't know the details. She just wasn't there one day." I thanked Sandra for everything. I told her she was talented and that any company that hired her was getting more than they knew. I meant every word. I hung up and sat in my office, my COO office, with the window. And I thought about Gerald sitting at his desk, unable to look at me, saying the word restructuring like it was a weather report and not a lie. I thought about Brianna walking in on her first day with pastries and good intentions, and a father who loved her so much he handed her someone else's career without understanding what that would cost either of them. I thought about 9 years, about what I had built inside that company, about the routing system and the Nexus relationship, and the dozens of small structural decisions that had held that operation together in ways Gerald never fully saw because they never required his attention. He had never seen the work clearly enough to understand what he was losing. And that, more than anything, is what I want to say to anyone who is sitting where I was sitting 4 years ago, in a parking lot with a box of their things, trying to process what just happened to them. The people who underestimate you are not seeing clearly. They are seeing what they need to see to make their decision feel justified. They are seeing through the lens of what they want, and what they want has nothing to do with your actual value. Gerald didn't fire me because I wasn't good enough. He fired me because Brianna needed somewhere to land, and I was in the way, and he loved her more than he understood his own business. That is his failure, not mine. Hartwell Freight was acquired 6 weeks after Sandra's call. The purchase price, according to people in the industry who track these things, was substantially below where the company had been valued before Brianna arrived. The new ownership brought in their own team. They rebranded within the year. The name Hartwell Freight no longer exists. Calvary Logistics is now one of the fastest growing freight companies in our region. We have doubled our client base. We are entering 2 new markets this year. I have a team of 43 people and a budget larger than anything I managed at Hartwell, and the authority to actually use it. David proposed to me last spring, in the garden of the small house I have lived in since I rebuilt my life the first time. He did it quietly and without performance, which is exactly who he is. I said yes before he could finish asking. We are getting married in the fall, and I think about Gerald sometimes. I genuinely do, not with anger. The anger burned off a long time ago. I think about him the way you think about a chapter in a book that was necessary to get to the chapter you're in now, with a kind of detached appreciation for the role it played. He gave me 9 years of stability when I needed it. And then, when I had outgrown what he could offer, he pushed me out the door. He thought he was taking something from me. What he was actually doing was making room. Room for a better title, a better team, a better future than I would have built if I had stayed comfortable inside a company that had stopped being able to hold what I was becoming. Room for the window. I look out of it every morning when I come in, and every morning I think the same thing. Thank you, Gerald. I mean that. Studio microphone, narrator CTA, final. And that is where Marilyn's story ends. Or maybe, where it truly begins. She gave 9 years. She was pushed out in a Tuesday afternoon to make room for someone who wasn't ready. And she ended up COO of a better company, while her old one sold for less than it was worth. If this story hit you somewhere real, leave a comment. Tell me if you've ever had a Gerald in your life. Tell me what happened. Tell me what you wish you had done differently. I read every single one. And if you are new here, welcome to Success Wisdom Stories. Subscribe. Because every week I bring you stories exactly like this one, where the woman they underestimated becomes the woman they couldn't replace. I'll see you in the next one.